David Simon and Ed Burns' The Wire is often acclaimed as one of the greatest television shows of all time, if not the greatest. Such acclaim is not arbitrary. The Wire is deserving of its acclaim for many reasons, all of which could not be easily summarized. But perhaps the most compelling thing about The Wire is the way in which it captures, creates, and gives an account of the city. And not just any city, the city of Baltimore. But what is most interesting about The Wire's account of the city is not some abstract or theoretical idea about the city, but the people who live in and animate the city. It's not just about the soul of the city, but the souls that occupy and give the city life. Of particular interest to me is the way in which individual souls navigate their own identities amongst the city, if we understand the city to be a collection of individual souls that make up one soul. It is my impression that this is one of The Wire's main themes, the question of individual identity as it relates to others. Specifically, it seems quite clear that The Wire posits a conception of identity that is dependent on our own narratives and stories. The Wire complicates this, however. It is made explicit that we do not have full access to our narrative identity, and those pieces that we do have access to, we struggle to acknowledge and accept. In other words, who we are is not something we get to make up or control. The Wire is a dramatization of various individual people failing at or succeeding in the acknowledgement of their own stories, and their acceptance of an identity related to those stories. This theme is best captured by an important scene in Season 2, where D'Angelo Barksdale, as a part of a reading group discussing The Great Gatsby, reflects on F. Scott Fitzgerald's claim that there are no second acts in American lives.
He's saying that the past is always with us. And where we come from, what we go through, how we go through it, all this shit matters. I mean, that's what I thought he meant.
Go ahead.
Like at the end of the book, you know? Boats and tides and all. It's like you can change up, right? You can say you somebody new, you can give yourself a whole new story. But what came first is who you really are. And what happened before is what really happened. And it don't matter that some fool say different, because the only thing that make you different is what you really do or what you really go through. Like, you know, like all them books in his library. Now, he fronting with all them books. But if we pull one down off the shelf, ain't none of the pages ever been open. He got all them books, and he ain't read near one of them. Gatsby, he was who he was, and he did what he did. And because he wasn't ready to get real with the story, that shit caught up to him.
Here, D'Angelo adds an important piece that helps us understand The Wire's depiction of the struggle to acknowledge one's identity. He claims that if we fail at the daunting task of getting real with the story, those failures will catch up to us, possibly consuming and destroying us. I see this narrative being played out in many of The Wire's characters. There is, however, one example of this thematic narrative that complicates and accentuates D'Angelo's compelling philosophy, and that is the narrative of the oft-forgotten Ziggy Sobotka. What Ziggy's narrative adds to D'Angelo's is the fact that our own failures to get real with the story are not merely our own responsibility. Failing to get real with the story is not the result of a lack of willpower, but is, in many cases, the result of the manipulation of persons, stories, and identities by those other than the self in question. What Ziggy's story demonstrates is that the other, just as much as the self, can be a catalyst in our failure to get real with the story and who we are. In other words, others are implicated in the denial of ourselves. Thus, I want to propose that Ziggy presents a subversion of D'Angelo's notion of getting real with the story. Although Ziggy does fail to get real with the story, this is primarily caused by the failure of the story to get real with him. Why and how is this the case? How can a story fail to get real with a person? My argument will break down into two basic theses. First, I will argue that the story that Ziggy is tasked with inheriting is not an inheritable story. Second, and stemming from the first, I will show that although Ziggy is not built for the inheritance of the Sobotka story, he is tricked and manipulated into thinking that he is. Allow me to explicate on my first thesis. In order to do this, I must provide an account of the story and legacy that Ziggy is tasked with inheriting. Ziggy's father, Frank Sobotka, is the treasurer and kingpin of the stevedore union at the Baltimore docks. Because Ziggy is the son of Frank, there is an implicit pressure for Ziggy to live up to the legacy and stature of his father, and Ziggy knows this much. In a scene near the beginning of the season, Ziggy rejects an offer from his dad to go to college, and instead reflects on his memories of the docks and, even though he is struggling with it, expresses a desire to inherit and maintain this way of life. This legacy and stature, however, functions within a particular logic, what St. Augustine would call the libido dominandi, or the lust for domination. The work environment of the docks revolves around an ethos of hard work, competition, and power. Good workers are those that make outward displays of toughness, strength, masculinity, seniority, and stoicism. It is play or get played. This is not to say that these characteristics are vices in themselves, but that when they are formed as a monolithic ethos, there are tragic repercussions for those unable to live up to those expectations. This puts a considerable amount of pressure on the younger workers on the docks, who are tasked with inheriting the often exaggerated ethos of the veterans. This dynamic predictably produces a discourse of competition between the old and young, as they fight for legitimacy in a growing world.
There was some fucking heroes back then.
Shit is thick in here tonight, Jimmy.
What can you do? This generation, they just don't know.
Ain't never gonna be what it was.
No, indeed.
Every night with these old fucks is like 1952 and shit.
Hey, boys, you know what? When I was your age, I unloaded 10 ships a goddamn day.
The problem for Ziggy is that he is not built to live up to the ethos of the docks. Physically and psychologically, Ziggy falls short of the standards set by his father and the rest of his peers and coworkers. Ziggy is young, fragile, sensitive, weak, lacking in intelligence, unfaithful, disrespectful, and passionate. He sticks out like a sore thumb, and he is constantly scapegoated, blamed, and made fun of. Because of this, Ziggy must resort to forms of compensation, ways to make himself more like his peers. This is clearly marked by his ridiculous antics, language, and constant attempts to take out and show off his large penis, so as to prove his legitimacy as one who can dominate and compete. I do not think that Ziggy's obsession with his own phallus is a coincidence considering his troubled disposition. It is, in a sense, his only successful claim to a logic of penetration, domination, and mastery. The combination of these different conditions make it nearly impossible for Ziggy to live a normal life on the docks in his father's and peers' footsteps. But there is another reason why Ziggy is unable to inherit the story of the docks, beyond his physical and psychological inabilities. With the advent of the neoliberal global market, the port unions are struggling to stay alive, with less and less ships coming in, and therefore, less and less work for the locals. The younger dock workers with low seniority, like Ziggy and his cousin Nick, are not given enough hours to sustain a life, and are, therefore, forced to find alternatives. So here we have two senses in which Ziggy is unable to inherit or get real with his story. His own way of life is deemed inadequate by the monolithic standards of the docks, and regardless, there isn't enough work to sustain the possibility of Ziggy working on the docks by following his father. This inability to get real with the story on two levels opens up a third. Because of the lack of work and Ziggy's inability to fit in, he must find an alternative source of revenue in life. This leads Ziggy, along with his more responsible and respectable cousin Nick, to the drug trade. Ziggy starts out with low-level street deals, but Nick strikes up a business relationship with the Greeks, a global organization that runs drugs and products through port shipments. As one might predict, Nick takes the lead, handles the business, and keeps Ziggy out of the higher-level stuff. All the while, Ziggy is also humiliated and taken advantage of by a street dealer named Cheese, who beats him up and burns his car for not paying his debts. These complications only serve to damage Ziggy's character and identity further. Ziggy wants a chance to have responsibility and prove others wrong, but he is constantly robbed of that opportunity.
That the man?
You don't have to concern yourself.
I want to
with
meet
that.
him.
Let me handle the business. I mean, you're getting paid, right?
Fuck you. I'll play the game for myself.
Take the money, Zig.
Oh, you don't think I can do it?
Pick up the fucking money, Ziggy.
I don't want it. You pick it up.
You.
Fuck you.
Once again, Ziggy's ability to participate and play the game for himself is thwarted through Ziggy's repeated failures and the inability for others to trust and depend on him. All Ziggy wants is for someone to acknowledge him and entrust him with responsibility, but because of his continuous screw-ups, fragile character, and overall strangeness, nobody wants to let him play. So here we have arrived at 3 different ways in which Ziggy's ability to get real with the story is impeded by outside forces in collaboration with Ziggy's own shortcomings. Therefore, I would like to move on to my second thesis, the claim that although Ziggy is clearly not fit for the ethos of the docks, he is manipulated into thinking that he is. Because of his fragile and easy to make fun of character, Ziggy's peers and coworkers on the docks take advantage of his disposition knowingly and intentionally. It amuses them to control someone unlike themselves, someone who lives a blatantly strange life. But instead of being honest with Ziggy and his failures, they lead him on and let him believe that he is a true king of the docks. The main way this becomes manifest is when several dock workers convince Ziggy that he is strong enough to fight a coworker who has recently disrespected him.
You ain't gonna let that shit ride, are you? After what he done did?
I truck his ass, it was me.
He's built kind of solid, though.
Man, Maui ain't all that. It's the clothes that give him size, eh?
You think?
Yeah, his ass is candy, Zig. You're a legend. A legend of the docks.
You old pussy, Zig. Cold cocking. Take him, Zig. Where's the time? Yeah, what he was talking.
The result of this manipulation is tragic. Ziggy cannot get real with the fact that he is not made for the docks because his peers refuse to be honest with him. There is no way for Ziggy to acknowledge himself and his shortcomings because those who surround him trick him into believing that he has everything figured out. It is no surprise that the combination of my 2 theses serve to completely shatter Ziggy's character. He ultimately has nowhere to go. He can't fit in on the docks, he can't make the drug trade work, but he is manipulated into thinking that these are the only options for him. Therefore, he is left with no option but to destroy himself. Both literally and allegorically, Ziggy is stuck alone on top of a shipping container. The straw that breaks the camel's back is the result of a further attempt for Ziggy to earn legitimacy. Ziggy is eventually given a shot to prove himself with the Greeks as he works alone to steal cars from a port shipment. The robbery goes well and the Greeks are pleased. But, regardless of Ziggy's good work, he is shorted his cut of the money, likely because the Greeks know that they can get away with it.
You know, them cars list out at better than 60 thou each.
20% was last week. Today the quote is 10. Still, it's good money for a few hours work, eh?
No! Oh no! No fucking way! We had a deal, motherfucker, a deal! You listen to me. It was my fucking ass out there on the line. Mine. And this piddling shit is the best that you come up with? You don't play me like that. You don't.
Losing his sense of himself, Ziggy decides to take revenge.
Please.
This last straw completely shatters Ziggy's identity. The knowledge of what he has done causes him to break down in the car, making no attempt to escape, as if he is aware of his completely nullified identity. simultaneous failure of Ziggy to get real with the story, and of the story to get real with him, renders his identity shattered and without form. The fact of Ziggy's shattered identity becomes explicitly transparent when Frank comes to visit Ziggy in jail. During their conversation, Frank asks Ziggy what happened and what got him to this point. Ziggy shares that he was tired of being the punchline to every joke. Frank is puzzled and asks why Ziggy didn't just come to him with his problems. For Ziggy, this clearly wasn't an option. He expresses the absence of Frank in his life, how he wasn't heard and wouldn't have been heard. Frank was too busy trying to save his union under the guise of self-sacrifice for the goods of others and his family, when in reality, it came at the expense of others. When Ziggy breaks down and expresses his disgust at what he did, Frank consoles him by saying that it wasn't really him.
That ain't you, Zig.
It ain't. 'Cause the same blood don't flow for us, Pop. I mean, I wish it did, but it don't.
You're more like me than you know. You're Sobotka.
Fucked is what I am.
Some may be tempted to interpret this as evidence for Ziggy's adoption, or his being born of a different father, but I think this interpretation would miss something important going on here. The point is not that Ziggy lacks the literal blood of his father, but that because he has failed to live up to his namesake, and because he is given no alternatives, he is no longer himself. Through Frank's absence, Ziggy was never given or taught how to live an alternative life. Instead, Ziggy was tasked with inheriting a monolithic identity and legacy, which ultimately fools him into believing that identity and its relation to story is something static and one-dimensional. There are ways to acknowledge and be honest with one's history and story without attempting to copy it in an identical fashion. Story is always growing, it is always being interpreted in new ways and is being lived out in non-identical repetitions. But as Ziggy sees it, story and identity is something final and fixed. This could be seen as the opposite of Gatsby's mistake, as accounted for by D'Angelo. Instead of doing what Gatsby does, ignoring his story and making up his own, Ziggy is forced into believing that the past is the only option in a zero-sum game. Ziggy is either a true Sobotka through an identical repetition of his father, or he is nothing. This one-dimensional identity is presented to Ziggy. He is taught that this is his only option, and he is manipulated into thinking that it is the right option. And when he predictably fails at this impossible task, his identity is nullified. He isn't a Sobotka, he isn't even Ziggy, he is simply fucked.
I was born with my papa's son, wandering out a smoking gun. Now some of you would live through me, then lock me up and throw away the key, or just find a place to hide away and hope that I'll just go away.